Blonde girl hang from tree for dare to bring food to Indians until a Comanche warrior rides in with 300 soldiers to rescue her. New Mexico Territory, April 3, 1858. Before dawn, U.S. military outpost near the Comanche border. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the parched plain, kicking up fine red dust that clung to the edges of canvas tents and rusted rifles. The sky was the color of ash and the moon smeared behind clouds cast a sickly glow over the execution yard of Fort Brazos. Soldiers lined the perimeter, their uniforms dulled by sand, their eyes sunken with something between duty and dread. At the center of the yard stood a crude wooden scaffold, freshly built and swaying gently in the wind. Upon it stood Eliza Monroe, the daughter of Captain Monroe, barefoot, her hands tightly bound behind her back. Her white dress clung to her body, stained with blood and dirt along the hem. Long strands of golden hair whipped across her face, and the noose hung loosely above her collarbone like a curse waiting to tighten. She was about to be hanged for the crime of bringing food to the enemy. A soldier with trembling hands adjusted the rope. The officer beside him, older, grizzled, called out in a weary voice, "May the Lord receive your soul." Eliza's blue eyes met the horizon. She did not plead, she did not cry, her lips moved, but no sound came. And just as the sergeant raised his hand to give the final order, boom, a drum beat shattered the silence. Then another, and another, low, steady, rolling like distant thunder across the desert. Heads turned, eyes scanned the darkness beyond the palisade walls. Lanterns flared. A young private stumbled backward and cried out, "Sir, movement on the east ridge." Up on the bluff, where the brush met the dying moonlight, a flicker caught the eye. Then another signals, mirrors, or polished metal flashing in sequence. Then from the blackness beyond came the impossible sight. A line of riders emerging like phantoms from the storm. Cloaks trailing behind them, feathered lances glinting in the dust-choked air. 100, then 2, then 300 mounted Comanche warriors fanning out across the ridge line like the crest of a wave preparing to crash. "Form ranks," a lieutenant screamed. "To your stations. Ready arms." But they were too late. The gate exploded open with a sound like bone snapping, and a single rider tore through faster than the rest, cloaked in black, atop a stallion the color of night. His chest was bare beneath the open deerskin vest, painted with streaks of white and crimson, and from his left wrist hung a braided piece of pale fabric, fine linen, torn, stained. The executioner froze as the rider charged directly at the gallows, his eyes locked not on the soldiers but on the girl in white. "Eliza," the man called, his voice sharp as flint and carried by the storm. She raised her head, dazed, lips parted. The noose was tightening and then impact. The black stallion crashed into the scaffold with a violent thud. The platform cracked. The rope jerked. Eliza's feet left the wood. For one heartbeat, she hung in the air like a fallen angel caught between earth and sky. But the warrior was already there. With a leap that defied belief, he mounted the platform as it collapsed beneath her. His knife flashed in a single arc, steel against hemp. The rope snapped. Eliza fell into his arms, limp and breathless, her head rolling against his chest. "Hold your fire," someone shouted, but a rifle cracked. The shot missed. The warrior spun, shielding her body with his own, and fixed the shooter. With a gaze so piercing, the man dropped his weapon. "No," the warrior said. Quiet, but final. He did not raise a weapon. He made no threat. He simply held her. The Comanche riders surrounded the fort in silence. Not a single war cry was uttered. They did not attack. They stood as if waiting. The only sound was the wind and the faint uneven breath of the girl he had saved. Then slowly the warrior turned his horse and rode from the gallows. Eliza cradled in his arms like something holy that had been nearly lost to the world. The soldiers parted. No one stopped him. Not a word was spoken. The sound of hoof beats faded into the rising sun and in their wake only dust remained. New Mexico Territory. 3 months earlier, Fort Brazos, holding quarters. It began with the scent of crushed mint and the silence of stone. Eliza Monroe often moved through the lower corridors of Fort Brazos with a satchel of dried herbs and quiet resolve. She had learned to keep her steps light, her voice softer than the wind that threaded through the narrow passageways. Though officially her duty was to deliver medicine to the sick and wounded within the garrison, she had quietly taken it upon herself to tend to the prisoners, as well. Those kept in the holding cells beneath the fort, where daylight never reached, and names were replaced by numbers. The Comanche were kept furthest from view, deeper underground, locked behind thick iron doors, and watched by men who saw them only as threats. But Eliza saw differently. Fever did not care about flags, and hunger made no distinction between languages. She never asked for permission. She simply brought what she had. Peppermint for nausea. Willow bark for pain, yarrow for wounds that refused to close. One evening, as she paused near a cell whose door was marked only by a chalked X, she knelt to place a folded cloth of herbs near the wall's edge. The air was thick and damp, and the stone chilled her fingertips. She reached forward, about to leave the bundle, when a voice, deep and deliberate, rose from behind the wall. "I smell peppermint. Do you bring medicine or mercy?" Startled, Eliza froze. The voice did not carry the rough edge she expected. It was steady, thoughtful, even curious. She straightened her back, unsure whether to respond. "I bring medicine," she answered after a moment. "Mercy is not mine to offer." There was a pause, then a quiet chuckle, spoken like someone who still believes in rules. "I believe in healing," she said. "Whatever name it wears." The voice came again, softer now. "You are not a soldier." "No," she replied. "I am the daughter of one." Another silence stretched between them, filled only by the slow trickle of water along the stone. "They call me Nun," he said at last, "but I am not sure if that name means anything here." She placed the bundle of herbs gently on the floor near the slit where the wall met the ground. "It means something now," she said. "You've spoken it aloud." From that night forward she returned to the same place after dusk, always under the pretense of tending the sick, and always she paused by that wall. They spoke not of the war that had brought them to this place, but of smaller things, the taste of mesquite honey, the sound of rivers after rain, the stars she could barely see above the barracks roof. He told her stories in fragments, of a brother lost in smoke, of a mother who taught him to read the wind, of a time when the land still belonged to those who knew how to listen to it. In return, she spoke of her mother's garden back east, long buried under snow and memory, and of the ache in her chest that had nothing to do with illness. They never saw each other's faces, only voices passed between them. Whispers through the cracks of a world that no longer made room for understanding. But somehow those voices began to matter more than any face could. And though she would never admit it aloud, Eliza came to wait for his words like prayer. By the second week of her clandestine errands, Eliza Monroe had memorized the pattern of the guards' patrols better than the scriptures her father once insisted she recite at supper. She waited until the changing of the watch, when the night turned quiet, and the soldiers grew weary of shadows, to slip out of her quarters with a basket tucked beneath her cloak. Within it, wrapped in linen and hidden beneath dried lavender, she carried small parcels, bread crust softened in milk, a flask of rainwater, and crushed herbs bound in ribbon. Each offering was simple, but to the women and children confined behind the crude wooden barriers of the auxiliary holding camp, it was salvation. She never lingered long, just enough to pass a bundle through the bars, whisper a word of comfort in broken Apache or Comanche, and disappear before suspicion grew. No one questioned her presence by daylight. After all, she was the commander's daughter, and the sick quarters often needed tending. But by moonlight she became something else entirely, a ghost with gentle hands and silent steps. It was during one such errand, beneath a silver-bleached sky and the sighing of cottonwood trees that she wandered too close to the restricted perimeter, the part of the holding zone reserved for combatants deemed dangerous, men shackled like beasts in crude stone pins. A lantern had been left burning low near the far corner of the path, drawn by its glow and the faintest sound of coughing from within. Eliza knelt beside the wall and reached into her basket. "Water," she whispered, her voice nearly lost to the wind. But before she could lower the flask, she felt it. A presence, solid, quiet, not sudden, but patient, as if it had been there long before she noticed. She looked up. He was standing less than 10 feet away, not behind the wall this time, but out in the open, within the shadows beyond the fence. Nakone, no longer just a voice behind stone. His wrists were bound with leather, his shirt torn, but he stood upright, his gaze fixed on her without flinching. The moon lit half his face, high cheekbones, a faint scar tracing his jaw, and eyes dark as onyx, reflecting not hatred, not scorn, but something more unsettling. Recognition. Their eyes locked, neither moved. In those suspended seconds, the prison yard, the camp, the war, they all seemed to fall away. Eliza's breath caught in her throat, not from fear, but from the sheer stillness between them, the unspoken weight in the space where words would fail. She had imagined this moment through stone and shadow for nights. Yet now that it was real, she felt both exposed and seen. He did not speak. He did not need to. When she finally turned and left, she did so with trembling fingers and a strange pressure in her chest. That night, in the privacy of her candle-lit quarters, she opened a blank page in the journal hidden beneath her floorboard and wrote one line. I met the man behind the voice. He looks at the world as if it betrayed him and at me as if it might still be saved. From then on, she wrote to him more than she dared speak. Words flowed from her heart onto pages never sent. Reflections, fears, fragments of questions she did not have the courage to ask aloud. They were not love letters, not yet. But they were steps in that direction, echoing with longing and guilt and the dangerous beauty of connection. A week later, she returned to the same stretch of wall. He was there waiting. She did not speak right away. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a square of fabric, white cotton, finely embroidered around the edges with green thread. In the center, carefully stitched in her neatest hand, were the words, to the one I'll never touch, but always feel. She passed it through the gap in the wood. He accepted it with reverence, folding it once, before pressing it to his chest. That was the first gift she ever gave him, and the last that bore her name. It happened quickly, and yet the memory would stretch in Eliza's mind like a bruise that never faded. She had done it a dozen times before, slipped past the patrols, delivered what little she could to the prisoners, who had no names, only numbers and bruises. But on that night, the routine betrayed her. The bread was still warm, wrapped in linen, and pressed with lavender to disguise its scent. As she knelt by the enclosure and reached through the slats to hand it to a young Comanche mother whose child whimpered in fever, a voice behind her shattered the stillness. What in God's name do you think you're doing? Eliza froze. The loaf fell from her fingers. She turned slowly to find Private Granger, young, zealous, too eager to prove himself, standing just feet away, rifle raised, eyes wide with the dawning thrill of accusation. Step away from the cage, ma'am, he said, though the word ma'am came out laced with contempt. I was delivering medicine, she answered calmly, though her voice betrayed the thunder in her chest. Read is not medicine. Before she could reply, he stepped forward and grabbed her arm too tightly. The prisoners behind the fence recoiled as if they too felt the sudden shift. You're under arrest, he said almost breathless. You're aiding the enemy. They dragged her through camp like a criminal, through mud and whispers and stares that pierced her skin worse than any blade could. By dawn, she stood before a tribunal. 2 officers and her father at the head, their faces gray and grim. Captain Monroe did not meet her eyes. Not at first. Do you deny the charges? One of the officers asked. I do not, she said simply. You admit to providing supplies to hostile captives. I gave food to mothers and children, she replied. Not sabers or maps. Food, that distinction is irrelevant, the second officer snapped. They are enemies of the state. Her father finally looked up. Eliza, he said, voice low and strained. Do you understand what you have done? She held his gaze. Yes, and I would do it again. The silence in the room was sharp enough to wound. He exhaled. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the pen. I cannot protect you. I am not asking you to, she replied. With the weight of both command and bloodline pressing down on him, Captain Monroe signed the order. Guilty of treason by aid to the enemy, sentenced to hang by rope until dead. By noon, word spread across the fort. The commander's daughter, once the symbol of civility and compassion within the harsh frontier post, was now condemned as a traitor. She was moved to a dark, narrow cell beneath the officers' quarters, its walls slick with old rain and the echoes of other confessions. No light, no bedding, just stone and the dull ache of inevitability, and no one did not come because no Kane did not know. 3 days earlier, he had attempted to escape during a prisoner transfer. He had used a shard of broken glass to slice the binding on his wrist and nearly made it to the outer fence before being tackled by 3 guards. Since then, he had been kept in solitary confinement, shackled in an underground chamber so deep even the wind could not reach him. In that void, Eliza felt her breath begin to slow, not from fear, but from the weight of being forgotten. She spoke to no one, ate nothing, thought only in fragments until the 3rd night. Her fingers, scraped raw from the cold stone, found the heel of her boot. Hidden in its lining, was the last page of the journal she had once kept, folded tightly, and wrapped in oil paper to protect it from moisture. She flattened it against the floor, tore a pin from her hair, and pressed the point into her skin until blood welled at the tip of her index finger. By the flickering light of a dying candle, she wrote in uneven lines, If I die and you do not come, I forgive you. If you come and die because of me, I never will. She folded the page again, this time with trembling hands, and placed it inside the arch of her other boot. It was not a letter meant to be read. It was a confession meant to survive her. In the lowest pit of the fort, where no moonlight dared to reach, none lay shackled to a post buried in the rock. His breath came slow, his lips split from thirst, and his wrists burned beneath the iron cuffs. The silence around him was so thick it pressed against his thoughts like smoke. Days had passed without voice or sign. The world above might have burned, and he would not have known. Then came the sound, barely a breath, barely human. A whisper through the ventilation slid no wider than a coin. Nakone lifted his head. "Brother," the voice said again, ragged with desperation. "Eliza is to die at dawn." The voice belonged to a boy named Kati, no older than 10, who had escaped the holding camp days earlier and hidden in the crawl space beneath the supply house. It was he who had seen Eliza dragged across the yard, her white dress stained, her head held high, her sentence proclaimed to the sky. Kati had risked everything to crawl through the mud tunnels and whisper through a vent that barely let in air. At the name, Nakone surged forward, the chain scraping against stone as his shoulders strained. "Where?" he demanded, though his voice came out like wind through sand. "Here in the yard." 4 days from now, Kati pressed a water skin through the slit. "I cannot help more. They will see me. But she saved my sister." And then the boy was gone. No one did not sleep that night. He did not close his eyes. When the guards came in the morning, they found the cuffs empty. The chains snapped like ribbon. A smear of blood marked the corner wall. No one was gone. He ran east first, not west, through arroyos and broken ravines barefoot, cloaked in a stolen poncho. He traveled by night, hid by day, and fed on roots and dew. When he reached the edge of the high desert, where the red sand curled into cracked stone, he knelt and pressed his palm into the earth. He had not called for war in over a year. He had sworn he never would again. But this was not a call for war. This was a call for those who remembered her name. By the second dusk, he reached the old meeting stone, a place where warriors once painted plans in blood and ash. Now only ghosts gathered there. But one by one the living came, not young men hungry for battle, but veterans with silence in their eyes. Men who had buried wives, who had lost children, who had seen mercy in a pale Ha river. They did not ask why he summoned them. They only asked how long they had. Nikon stood before them, bare-chested, the sun carving shadows down his ribs. He pulled from his pouch a narrow strip of leather, braided hair from his wife, kept close since the night she fell under American bullets. He walked to the old cedar tree and knelt beside it. "This kept me alive," he said quietly. "But I have lived long enough for her." He removed the braid and placed it beneath a stone at the tree's roots. Then slowly he unwrapped a second bundle, a golden strand, delicate and tied with green thread, the piece Eliza had tucked into the corner of a cloth she once gave him when he could only love her through walls. He tied it around his wrist. A hush fell. "She saved our children," he said. "Now I ask not for revenge. I ask for help to save the one who saved us." No man raised a spear, but every head nodded. And when the moon rose over the third night, 300 riders gathered at the canyon's mouth, horses draped in silence, drums strapped to their backs, mirrors gleaming in their saddle bags. No weapons, no war cries, only thunder that would speak her name. And that was all they needed. The sky above Fort Brazos had turned from gray to gold, the rising sun slicing through the dust like a blade through silk. The storm had passed, but the tension had not. Silence hung over the courtyard like a held breath, broken only by the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof, or the faint rustle of banners forgotten in the commotion. Eliza stirred, her throat burned, raw from the noose, and every breath scraped like fire through her chest. But she was alive. She felt the warmth of arms around her, firm, familiar, the scent of leather and earth clinging to the skin she had never touched until now. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was the sky. The second was Nikoni holding her as if she were made of glass and memory. She tried to speak, but no sound came. She noticed, shifted her gently in his arms, and set her down upon the wooden platform, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek with fingers roughened by stone and war. His gaze held hers for a long moment. There was no need for words. Then the sound of boots on gravel drew their attention. Captain Monroe stood 10 paces away, his uniform dusty, his hat gone, his face pale and stray with sweat. In his hand, a revolver trembled, its barrel pointed directly at Noni's heart. "Step away from my daughter," he commanded, though his voice cracked at the edges, caught between order and agony. None did not move. He did not reach for a weapon. Instead, with a slow, deliberate breath, he shifted onto his knees and bowed his head, not in submission, but in offering. "I did not come to fight you," he said quietly. "I came to return what your justice tried to take." Monroe's jaw tightened. The revolver steadied slightly. "She's my daughter," he said. "And she's my life," Nikon replied. Eliza sat up slowly, her fingers still trembling from the lack of air. She turned to her father, her voice but firm. "If you shoot him, you will kill the only man in this place who ever chose mercy." "She betrayed her people," Monroe said, though the words landed flat, even in his own mouth. "No," Eliza said, rising shakily to her feet. "I chose people over sides. I chose the child with fever. I chose the mother who wept. I chose the man who listened to me through a stone wall when no one else would." Monroe's gun wavered. "He's not a soldier," he said aloud to no one in particular. "She's not supposed to choose sides." Nunn lifted his head then slowly calmly. "Then you never understood her at all." Eliza walked between them. She placed one hand on Nakoni's shoulder, the other reaching toward her father, but she did not plead. She did not beg. "If you shoot him," she said, "you will have to shoot me too." There was a long, dreadful silence. The wind picked up, tossing sand across the stones where she had nearly died just minutes before. Monroe looked at her. Really looked. His daughter, so pale, so bruised, and yet standing between life and death, as if it were the only place she had ever belonged. His hand dropped. The revolver hit the ground with a muted thud. He turned away. "I have lost too much already," he whispered. "You've made your choice, and I can no longer stop you." And with that, he walked past them slowly, shoulders heavy, the weight of command crumbling behind him with each step. Nunn rose. Eliza leaned into him, and for the first time their hands found each other without fear. The Comanche riders stood still as stone beyond the broken gates, watching, waiting, not as conquerors, but as witnesses. The rope still hung from the gallows, but no one looked up anymore. The sun had fully broken over the horizon by the time Nunn lifted Eliza into the saddle. The black stallion beneath them stood steady, ears twitching at the wind, as if even the beast understood that the world had changed with the dawn. All around them, the riders waited in silence. 300 Comanche warriors, cloaked in dust and resolve, formed a living corridor from the execution yard to the open gate of Fort Brazos. Their faces bore no expression of triumph or challenge. They held no banners, no blades, only the quiet unity of a people who had answered a call not for blood, but for love. The Khan mounted behind Eliza, his arms gently circling her waist, careful not to press too hard against the bruises that still darkened her ribs. She leaned back into him without a word, her breath shallow. The pounding in her chest now less from fear and more from the wonder that she still breathed at all. The gate, once a symbol of division, now creaked open under the weight of stillness. No soldiers barred the way. No officer gave chase. The men of the garrison, once proud, once certain, stood motionless in the shadows of their own command. Eyes lowered, weapons holstered. Polker said they watched her pass like they were watching a ghost. Captain Monroe did not appear again. The stallion stepped forward, hooves soft against the earth. As Nakoni and Eliza moved into the column, the warriors ahead began to ride slowly at first, then more confidently, like water reclaiming the dry riverbed. No horns sounded, no drums beat. The only music was the wind whispering across the open land. As they cleared the last post of the fort, Eliza turned her head. She looked back over her shoulder, back at the yard where she had stood on wood that creaked beneath the weight of final judgment, back at the scaffold that had nearly claimed her life, and the flag that had once meant protection, but now fluttered like a forgotten prayer. Smoke curled up from a breakfast fire. A dog barked faintly in the distance, but to her eyes the fort already looked like memory, hazy.